because we could have made a decision to just be quite conservative and say, we'll buy what we can afford with our own money, and that a certain trajectory that you can then follow. But we were pretty bullish, so we said no. We want to have enough stock so that if things go well, we can actually accommodate that and not have all the stuff that happens when you're out of stock. So to be completely transparent, I shopped around a lot to get the best deal for the company, both in terms of how much capital can we get, what's the cost of that capital, what are the terms. So I really did my homework.
Welcome to the Wayflyer Founder Series. Really excited about this one today. My name's Paul Waddy from Paul Waddy Advisory and eCom Nation. I'm also an advisor with Wayflyer. Today I'm joined with Chris, one of the co-owners of Joolca and also the head of marketing. Chris, welcome. Thanks for coming on board.
Yeah, thanks. Really happy to be here.
Now, Chris, Joolca is a business that I'm fascinated with, and there's so many interesting elements that we'll probably try and unpack. But for those tuning in, could you tell us a bit about Joolca and how it started and the problem that it solves for consumers?
Yeah, definitely. So Joolca is a direct-to-consumer camping brand. So we operate just like in the e-com space. And the problem that we're trying to solve is bringing indoor comforts outdoors. So we've tackled that with a hot shower solution, or basically hot water for hot showers out in the bush, off grid, as well as for washing up the dishes and stuff like that at your campground. So that's where we're at the moment, but we're looking to grow the product range and really cover all aspects of that.
And what I love about Joolca is you guys are so dedicated to product, and one of the things that I always look for in a business, particularly when people come forward with business ideas, is I encourage them to answer the question, what problem does your product solve? And you've got a pretty cool problem that you're solving for, right? With the showers, hot showers when you're camping. On the product side of things, just tell people a bit about how that product actually does that.
Yeah, so Mac, the founder of the company, really kicked it off with the Hot Tap, which is our hero product right now. And that's really that's allowed us to launch across the world. And in terms of how it works, it's pretty basic. Barbecue gas bottle, hooks up to that, pulls in the water from a jerry can, bucket, river, creek, or if you've got pressurized water, and you flick the switch like you do at home. A few seconds later, you've got hot water coming out, your shower, it's all plumbed in, or with the kitchen sink.
Yeah, and I think I've had the privilege of working a little bit with you guys, and one thing I note about Jack is he's really product obsessed, and I just think that desire to get ahead of the game with product is, from my opinion, one of the moats that you guys have built around the business. And Chris, there's a lot of family in the business. There's a few of you there knocking around. How do you manage that dynamic, and how does each family member fit into the business and find their home, and how does that whole dynamic work?
Yeah, so you said Jack before with the product, so it's Mac who founded it, and Jack is heads operations, and while I'm at it, I'm head of marketing, and Bart is head of customer service. And so 4 boys running the company. In terms of how does that work, or kind of how I just described, we've all taken on a certain department or responsibility. And yeah, I mean, it can get pretty tricky at times. It's kind of like that saying, too many chefs in the kitchen. So we kind of have 4 chefs in the kitchen at any one time. So it can be challenging, but at the same time, really, really good, really rewarding, because we're all brothers, and we all want the best for each other in the company and the brand. So yeah, I'd say we're pulling it off pretty good at the moment.
Yeah, and I like that you have those 4 very succinct, clear roles for each of you. Now, yours would have been one of the businesses, I suppose, that was pretty dramatically impacted during COVID, I would imagine, given that international travel was cut out, and I suppose I know you're more than just in Australia, certainly, but people wanting to explore their own backyards. How was COVID for you guys?
So So long story short, it was good.
Yeah.
Right. Good to great. I think ecom in general benefited from COVID. Lots, people sitting at home, a lot more impressions available when it comes to buying media ads. People, I think, you can't go out and buy stuff at physical stores, at least in 2020. So people were transitioning to online. So ecom in general, I'd say, saw an uplift, a bit of a multiplier, but also being, I guess, in the outdoor space when you can't travel, but you could camp for the most part, if I recall correctly. We kind of got like I guess a second multiplier effect. So for us, 2020 and 2021 were really good years. Lots of growth. Pretty hard to manage actually. In terms of logistics, stockouts, pre-selling, and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think we pulled it off pretty good.
And the pre-selling is an interesting one because I know that you guys were doing some great months and some great numbers, and at times without having the inventory in. Have you managed to sort of get on top of that inventory position, or is it still operating mostly on pre-order? And if so, how did you sort of strategize around that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There's really a lot you can unpack there. Getting stock in 2020 and a lot of 2021 was really hard. It was, basically a logistical nightmare with all sorts of stuff. So, we were forced to pre-sell, which we had never done before, really. But it turned out to work really well. I guess brand and product were a really good fit, and people were happy to wait. But obviously pre-selling, it does cost you money. People change their mind, there's refunds, and you don't capture all the sales that you could because there's a 3 or 4 month wait. So we really need to transition that to, okay, we can pre-sell to sustain the business and still grow, but we do need to get on top of our sort of stock. And so we've done a number of things. We had some consultants come in, logistics bureau, to really implement like a world-class process for forecasting and managing stock and building up like a safety buffer of stock so that we could deal with acute increases in demand. But obviously that had cash flow implications too, because you can't just go and order a boatload of stock and you got to pay for that, right? So there were, it basically forced us to grow in a lot of ways and really increase like the sophistication of all of our, PO forecasting, cash flow forecasting, sales forecasting, the whole lot. Yep.
Yeah, and it's something that we've seen in e-commerce generally is businesses probably needing to hold slightly more stock than they have in the past to accommodate for some of these supply chain issues that you've encountered, that most retailers I think have encountered. It can be a bit nervy sort of when you've operated on much lower inventory holdings, having to then go in and buy with confidence. It sounds like you guys really did your homework with cash flow forecasts and so on. We're here as part of the Wayflyer founder series. So how does Wayflyer tie into your business there at Joolca?
So Wayfire has been a pretty big part of our growth. So obviously we're growing. We want to build up that safety stock. We ended up making a decision, because we could have made a decision to just be quite conservative and say we'll buy what we can afford, with our own money, and that's a certain trajectory that you can then follow. But we were pretty bullish, so we said no. We want to have enough stock so that if things go well, we can actually accommodate that and not have all the stuff that happens when you're out of stock. So, to be completely transparent, I shopped around a lot, right, to get the best deal for the company, both in terms of how much capital can we get, what's the cost of that capital, what are the terms. So I really did my homework, and Wayflyer ties in because they've really been able to help us out in terms of capital. At some points we've needed a fair bit, I guess relative to the size of our company and the sales and revenue that we do. So they've basically been able to give us everything we've ever asked for in terms of the capital. They're also really, really flexible. So, for us in particular, we've needed to sometimes split up the funding into 2 different tranches, and that's never been a problem. So, I think without them, things would have been a lot more difficult to manage. I'm sure we still would have pulled it off, but possibly with, piecing together 2 or 3 different solutions, and that would have been a bit of a nightmare. So.
Yeah, so would you be confident in saying that taking this finance with Wayflyer and sort of expanding your inventory holding has accelerated your growth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, there's a number of things to do with growth. Just having the stock there isn't gonna, it's not going to sell itself. So, there's more to it, but it's absolutely allowed us to have the stock there. And from a marketing and sales point of view, we don't have that negative, say, multiplier or whatever, that the brakes applied, which we saw when we have pre-sales. So we're in stock all regions, and that definitely, has helped with maintaining and growing sales.
And Chris, you obviously mentioned you did a lot of homework before making a decision to take on finance, regardless of who that would be. Picturing some retailers who might be listening to this and looking at funding, what's some advice that you would give them around the overall experience of taking on funding, doing homework, and some of your learnings?
Yeah. So, I mean, this may not be to the benefit of Wayflyer, but being completely honest, do your homework. Absolutely. The only way that I know that Wayflyer is better than the rest, at least based on my current sort of snapshot and my experience, the only way that I know that they're like the best, the most aggressive with giving you capital and the fees are competitive is because I did my homework, right? And so, yeah, I would say do your homework because it definitely comes in handy. But yeah, at the end of the day, I've put in lots and lots of time and effort and, putting people up against each other and stuff like that. And Wayflyer has, for I think the second or third time, come out far, on top of existing providers. So it's not to say that I'm going to stop doing my homework, but I'm pretty confident now in perhaps taking the foot off the gas in terms of looking at all the other providers. I'm a bit more confident now saying, okay, when I approach Wayflyer, I know I'm getting a good deal.
Yeah, I think that's a great endorsement. And I don't think Wayflyer would mind you saying that because I know they position themselves as proudly being put under the microscope and holding up. So, Chris, I wanted to, given your role as head of marketing at Joolca, I wanted to touch on what you've seen change in marketing. I mean, are you finding that businesses that are maybe too dependent on Facebook might need to start shifting gears as we're seeing cost per impressions rising, or are you sort of seeing, new channels starting to bear fruit, like, not sure how relevant in your field, but TikTok and these sorts of things? What are you seeing in marketing generally overall in e-com?
So, I mean, I can't speak for everyone, although I have, I participate in, forums and groups and stuff. So, I think it is pretty tough for e-com retailers at the moment. Certainly for us, maintaining that level of growth as we saw in 2020, 2021 is it's a bit more tricky now. Definitely, the cost per acquisition has gone up, which means when you look at your MER or whatever, it's not where we would have probably wanted it to be. So it is a bit more challenging. And some of the things that we're doing, at least, is we want to be less reliant on paid media, but also perhaps a bit less reliant on, say, Facebook or Google, which are our primary channels. So at a high level, with all the iOS changes and stuff that came about last year, and you lose that data, I've been looking at first-party tracking. So, there's Rockerbox, Highrose, Northbeam. So we've signed up with Northbeam to make sure that we can correctly attribute, when people buy, they buy across the spectrum, multiple touch points. So I think first and foremost, you need to have the best data possible. Otherwise, without that, you try and TikTok, your cost per click might be cheaper, but is it driving sales? You don't really know. So yeah, we're trying, getting a handle on the attribution, and also trying out new channels. we're hiring for like a partnership manager to break away from paid media and work with influencers, ambassadors, and stuff like that. And of course, improving website performance and email performance, because if you can improve those, more sales for the same money, improves MER. So yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff going on, but that's probably the high level sort of stuff.
Yeah, and that's great tips. The dependency on Facebook and Google is probably no longer, and partnerships is a great takeaway, I think, for anyone listening in. And Chris, I wanted to talk about export and international business, because I know there'll be people watching this who inevitably want to know, how do I sell my products overseas? I know you guys do this really well. How did that start for you? How did you find that your product was getting traction overseas?
So yeah, initially we were just an Aussie company, and pretty soon after we kind of expanded to New Zealand. It seemed like a pretty natural sort of fit. They're close by, whatever. But we always had our eyes set on the US, just such a big market. And we've always had people reaching out from all over the world saying, hey, can I buy your product in somewhere in Europe or the US? And we didn't really do any research on it. We just thought, such a big country, such a big market, it's got to work. That's kind of the extent of our research. And so we did it, and since then we've launched into where to go after that? UK after that, and then Canada. So right now we're in 5 regions. Europe is on the agenda for next year, and that's how we're approaching it. And I think at a high level, certainly the way that I look at it is, say you've got to invest $500,000 into R&D for a new product, right? Once that product is ready to go, ready to sell, if you sell it just into the Aussie market, you're really handicapping yourself. And so that same R&D investment now is split amongst 5 regions or 6 regions, and it should allow us with some more hero products to kind of really rapidly grow the company, because you're selling it to a massive audience now kind of overnight. So that's kind of been our strategy. Happy to go into that if that was too high level.
No, that was great, and I think I imagine that, is there some seasonality involved in your products, and does that balance in the Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere sort of balance that out?
There's absolutely seasonality, which is, coming from being just like an Aussie run company, the seasonality here is, at least for our brand, and being in the outdoor space, there isn't a whole lot, right? There isn't a whole lot. It's fairly consistent throughout. But going into the US, that just shifted things, and as a brand, we really had to, sharpen up a little bit around our purchasing and stuff and all that. But yeah, there's that, in the UK, Canada, US, which are large chunks of our revenue. There's lots of seasonality. Yeah.
And you spoke about the R&D, and I know you guys, particularly Mac, puts a lot into that R&D process. Do you see further product development as one of the keys for your growth? Or do you intend to build out the Joolca range?
Yeah, so that is such a good question. Obviously, for Aussie listeners, end of financial year is approaching, so we're internally working on our forecast for the next financial year, and we're going to see growth from existing products, right, that we have, but a large part of our growth is attributed to new product introductions. And so if we hadn't been putting that money in and investing, I think our growth this coming financial year would have been a lot less, right? It's definitely a massive part of the growth strategy. Also, for a brand like ours, where we're kind of a one-trick pony, it makes it really hard to optimize things like lifetime value or get customers to repurchase once you've acquired them, because there isn't a whole lot that they can buy. So
I think that's a really good point that you just touched on. Lifetime value, LTV, is a metric that I think is probably top 2 or 3 most important for a sustainable e-commerce business. And I think many retailers don't understand the importance of product behind the LTV, because as you say, if I don't know how many outdoor hot water systems for camping that I would need. So is that top of your mind when working on a product pipeline, is not just expanding the addressable market, but how do we bring our existing Joolca customers back into our purchasing cycle?
Yeah, it's definitely both of those. It's expanding the market, which I think we're kind of where we need to be for that. That's not really a bottleneck now, but absolutely expanding the product line, right? Obviously, with the vision of bringing indoor comforts outdoors, there's a lot more we can do to achieve that, and growing the product line is like strategically, that's one of the core levers that we're pulling on to make sure that we can continue to grow. Yeah.
I love it. I think it's great feedback for anyone listening to keep agitating on the product front and keep trying to strive to improve the product, not simply leaning on paid media or so on to do the heavy lifting. Chris, you guys have moved so much in the last few years. What's next for you? Where do you think the company's headed? It sounds like international's well and truly taking off. Where do you see it heading over the next 1 or 2 years at Joolca?
It's a really great question. So, I mean, we've got some pretty lofty growth targets, and I think as a company, we're pretty happy with where we are with, in terms of the regions and our product lineup, which I can't say too much about right now. We've got some really killer products coming up. So I think our focus is just going to be focusing on what we've got in front of us. We've got all the regions we need. We've got some amazing products. Let's really just make sure we get the maximum value out of that. So that's kind of going to be our approach. And what that might mean is hiring the right people, growing the team, increasing the sophistication of the business. I think that's probably where, certainly for the next 12 months, that'll be the focus. Yeah. And
Chris, in the interest of some tips for anybody that might be listening in, let's talk just about international strategies again. Do you feel, what are the key localization strategies that a retailer needs to consider going international? Is it currency, local currency? Do you need new websites in each country? Do you need a slick logistics offering? Do you need to hold the inventory in each market? What do you think are the key things that retailers need to consider before going into a new market seriously?
So, we operate on the Shopify platform, and I know that they have offerings to make it easy to expand into different regions and stuff, but having kind of dug into that, there always seems to be something that comes up where you end up getting to a bottleneck and saying, I really wish that we just had a local entity in the US, because that would have made things easier. So our approach as a brand, and this is where my, advice or whatever comes from, is we've essentially set up each region as its own brand. The Aussie company owns all of them, all the entities, but in the US, we've got a local company, local bank account. It's got its own domain, own ad accounts. Everything's, all the time zones and stuff are matching. It can become really, I think, difficult if you don't do it that way. It's a bit more work at the start to do it like that. But at least now everything is, when we go into our metrics, for example, all the time zones, the currencies, everything adds up. So that's how we've been doing it. At the moment, all of our domains are separate, which I don't like from an SEO point of view. I don't think that's the right way. But up until recently, Shopify hasn't really allowed you to have one domain for multiple regions. But that recently has changed. So, it's not much of a tip, is it? But I do think that it's saved a lot of headaches by having all of these entities done separately. I know a lot of people try and not do it that way. That includes warehousing in every region and stuff like that. But that could be more specific to us. Our product's bulky. We can't really ship wide from Australia.
Yeah, great tips. I mean, it's how you guys have done it successfully, so we certainly appreciate that insight. Now, Chris, I guess we'll finish off with a bit of a macro question here, and it's one that I'm sure you've heard many times before, but post-pandemic e-commerce, we've seen that in Australia, e-commerce is roughly 20% of traditional retail, pretty similar in the States and in most parts of the world. Maybe Europe is a little bit higher, but it has come back ever so slightly. There seems to be some businesses who are struggling with that come down effect, where many businesses did grow over the last 2 years, and potentially that's covered up some operating inefficiencies. And as that starts to settle, I'm seeing some businesses really struggle with the decreased sales, all of a sudden not having the cash to keep buying the inventory. If you were to look into your crystal ball, Chris, and look at the next 1 or 2 years in e-commerce, is it still a lucrative business for people to be in? Do you think that it's still, I mean, it is still on the up. We know that 20% is a long way to go. But with your global outlook, you do have exposure to different markets. What do you think we're in for the next 1 or 2 years?
Great question. I've got to get one of those crystal balls that you referred to.
Yeah, send it to you.
Yeah. What do I think? That's a tough one. I think there has been a bit of a rebound effect, right? Like what you just discussed. I think that's definitely a thing. Do I think it's going to be a problem or a hindrance long term? No. I do think brands and companies will have to readjust to things. Like, for example, we're seeing increased costs to acquire a customer, and that has an impact. So I think you got to smarten up, and you got to get good at your forecasting of stock and cash flows and everything. I think that's mandatory. There was a time when we weren't doing that, and that was a problematic time. So I think you got to get really up to speed there. But I think it's, as a brand, what we're focusing on is getting the right products made. So we're not interested in creating a product for the sake of adding another product to the store. We're only going to do it if it doesn't exist, or if we can do it a lot better than someone else. And I think if you approach it that way, you're generally pretty insulated to things. And maybe that's not true for every brand, but for us, that's definitely been our approach, where just get the right product out there that people actually want and need. And I think that does a lot of the heavy lifting for you.
I love it. And what I'm hearing there is you're running your own race. You're focused on what you guys can do to control your own destiny, including that international expansion, the product roadmap. And I think that's really important, is that businesses control the controllables and focus on what they're good at. The other part of that really that hits home for me, and is partly why we're here talking with Wayflyer in particular, is the forecasting. For me, the model is where it all starts, the financial model, and making sure that whichever path you take, you understand the funds that you need, the inventory that you need, that your business model passes the stress test. And I think that's really strong, sound advice for anyone tuning in. Chris, we're probably at time. I've really enjoyed that, and I thank you for your time and for joining us on the Wayflyer Founder Series today.
Yeah, no worries. It's been awesome. It's put me on a spot with a few questions, but yeah, it was really good. Thank you.
Appreciate your insights. Thanks, Chris.